We are, of course, being sponsored by Moral Sedali, which we're very, very pleased about, which allows us to get this process going. It's come about because Cheryl and I recognise that the shareholder engagement is just not good enough at all in this country, particularly. Cheryl's very much from the city. I'm more from the retail investor base. And we recognise this. We've been involved in the shareholder associations. We need to make this happen. And the only way we can see it happening is by kind of bringing everybody together. We all need to pull on this particular one. We all need to pull together. So by connecting people together gives us more chance of achieving something with this, because it's gonna, if we don't do this, it'll lead to massive wealth inequality and all sorts of other problems. We need to engage with the companies, with the investors, and have a more predictive way forward. So that's what the engagement appeal is aiming to do, which is spinning a lot of plates, an awful lot of plates. And we know it's a big challenge. And by having this approach, it should help us achieve it.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you, Emma. And in terms of the work that we have been undertaking as the engagement appeal, it's been a long process. It didn't happen overnight. We've been talking about this for 14 months, haven't we, Georgia? So it's amazing how communication and engagement can actually bring people together. So as I would have mentioned at the previous sessions, this started because I was in Cambridge and I got a phone call from a partner from Mishkondareya called Anjali, and she's very progressive, work in activism, and she wanted to find ways of actually engaging retail so that they can make a difference and can represent public good. So then we got chatting and thought, we should bring in some of the movers and shakers of the industry. So I thought of a few names and like, Catherine Howarth, the CEO of Share Action, because she's proven over the last 15 years that she's not insane. And guess what? Everyone is talking about climate now. So she's done amazingly. And then we thought about, what about this other company? This they seem really cool, called Chimelo. And I said, why don't we reach out to this Georgia Stewart? And then she said yes. And then, what about Tulip Share? And so then they said yes as well. And Antoine, the CEO, joined us. And then we had Edelman, the guys from The Unsustainable Truth, the co-authors, who are former hedge fund managers and then are now climate warriors. And then it grew from that to also include Professor Oliver Hart, Board Agenda, who then ended up steering our white paper, and then started getting some PLC interest from Peel Hunt, and then Equinity, my old boss there, Paul Matthews, who's been great because he has insight on the 800 PLCs that he used to oversee at Equinity, and Catherine Riley, the former CIO, COO of Viva, who's also at the FSCS. And so it's just continuing to grow. It's continued to grow, this informal committee. And finally, we released the white paper in April. So this white paper had gone through various iterations, right? So we thought initially, up until the 29th of November, before that meeting, that we had this down pat. So my initial vision was that companies should have a non-binding resolution on purpose. So I say on purpose. And we thought, wow, that would be an amazing goal. But actually, no, it's much more basic than that. It's about companies understanding what their shareholders actually want. And the premise for that is, if engagement is only isolated to the top 10, top 20 institutional shareholders, how do you actually truly understand what all your shareholders want? So basically, we launched the white paper and also launched the social venture, which is the engagement appeal. And we did that because our view was that you can't just stop at words, you need actions as well. And so we have been working very hard. So if I sound slightly drunk, I promise I'm not. It's because I actually haven't slept. But I've survived so far. But so that's the reason. So I got to meet Kirsty Britz because she is a nominee of the 2023 Dame Helen Alexander One to Watch Award. And it was great to meet you and to listen to you about your work at NatWest, but then also specifically on your work at Boohoo as a NED. It would be great to get your thoughts on that. Obviously, the opinions you're providing are your own. So we view you as a specialist in your area of sustainability. And we have Emma Reid, who is the company secretary of Essentra. We're most grateful to Essentra because of the support and trust that you have placed upon us, just like the trust that Mauro Sedali has placed on us, in that you guys are really valuing the S in ESG. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that. And also, you're a governance expert, so your thoughts on the place of shareholder engagement in the whole governance space. So should I hand over to Kirsty and give us like a 5-minute intro?
Thank you, Cheryl. So yes, 5 minutes you said, didn't you? So I'll try and stick to that. 3 things that I want to talk about that I'll expand on. The first one is that I believe engagement really is central to being a purpose-led business. So it's about going far beyond the ESG mandates that we all have and developing a much richer approach to being purpose-led. Secondly, the ESG itself is perhaps getting in the way of corresponding effectively with shareholders, and particularly with retail shareholders. And thirdly, that retail shareholders have growing agency. We've been talking about that a little bit already, and are a very rich source of intelligence and insight that we can choose to harvest, or we can ignore perhaps at our peril. So yes, as I said, I work at NatWest. I'm the Director of Sustainable Banking, as we call it there, but I've actually worked at 2 of the big banks. I used to work at Barclays. Prior to that, I've worked in tech, I've worked in telco, and I'm also a NED with Boohoo Group, and I work with the HMRC as well. So various roles, but my enduring interest over the years really has been in building more sustainable business and really improving that big business can become more valuable by being clear about and being actually led by its purpose and a sense of purpose. And that really does start, and I think end, with engagement. Engagement is an essential part of being purposeful, because who and how we choose to engage with really defines what being purpose-led is. How can we understand what social use and utility we can have if we don't have a deep understanding of what people think and need, and how that's changing, because it's changing all the time. And at the bank, so at NatWest, we do spend a lot of time looking at this rift between big business and the rest of our communities and society as a whole, and considering ways that we can do better by making that connection tighter with the world around us. So we listen to customers a lot, as you'd imagine, but also our suppliers, our staff, our communities, and young people, and the next generation too. And we actually built our own purpose around respecting that our business is essentially, as a big bank, in all its different guises, a set of relationships to be valued and invested in the long term. Because we are all in this era of relentless transparency, and society is expecting more from the private sector. But I think ESG is in danger itself of actually getting in the way of conversing well with stakeholders. Yeah. There's sort of a sense of irony to that, I suppose. But I think it's not enough now to perform well in a few of the ESG indices. For a start, which ones? Where do you start? There's a multitude. And they can be contradictory. They all have different biases. And famously, we see some of the best, potentially most sustainable organisations scoring the least well in some of the ESG indices. I think it's also not enough to expand the annual disclosures to meet the ESG reporting requirements. Compliance with the standards is incredibly onerous now. Again, there's a multitude of standards, so it's just actually the kind of the fight in a way to pick and choose and who and how you align and how you kind of still end up with a piece of communication that is sensible. And so I think that means that ESG reporting itself has expanded, but in a way that's not generating much insight when you look at it in the whole for the audience that we're trying to communicate with, and it's increasingly very technical in nature. It's always been quite technical, but I think that's probably getting more extreme. So we can end up in a situation where we have hundreds more pages of disclosure as a result of ES and G, but still no clarity in terms of what are the long-term risks and success factors for the business. So the challenge, I think, is how do you keep up with all of that? Because that can't be ignored, that's necessary, while remaining focused on following the real issues that really matter and are material to the success and the sustainability of the business. And for that, this is why we need thoughtful and continuous quality engagement, and engagement that is two-way, so not transmit and receive. And I think harvesting small retail shareholder opinion is really key to this, because as PLCs, we're practiced and mature, I guess.
So sorry.
It's good backdrop. At listening to the voice of larger institutional shareholders. But actually, even with those, I think the engagements can feel unsatisfactory. And Tolchan report spelled that out quite well, I think, at the end of last year. But again, seemingly more compliance-based. I'll use ESG again, but it's a sort of layer of ESG, perhaps creating some white noise as part of that, and a sense of competing stewardship between boards and investors, which could be helpful, but may not also be helpful as well if we're not clear on roles. So all of this sort of can perhaps feel like we're getting further from the type of strategic engagement that we all want and need. And then for smaller retail investors, it can, I think, be just a struggle to simply get access. If we find our annual report and accounts difficult to produce and our AGMs hard to manage, I think it's likely impenetrable and, quite frankly, sometimes turgid for many retail shareholders. But what an amazing, untapped, rich opportunity. I think the engagement appeal white paper sets it out really well. Just to quote from it, but 33% of Britain's own shares, retail shareholders do represent the UK, not in its entirety, but they are a good bench, and they do have an opinion on the issues that matter, the issues that they think need attention, and the issues that are shifting underneath our noses before perhaps we can see those shifts. And of course, being invested parties, they can provide that really useful early warning system, that radar, as an independent seam of intelligence. And yes, given the chance, can be incredibly vocal and direct about those issues. It can be quite an uncomfortable experience in terms of engagement. But particularly with ESG now becoming relatively politicized, particularly over in the US, when compared with larger institutional shareholders, I think it really can be quite helpful to have the balance, call it a counterbalance, or a balance of unguarded individual shareholder opinion as a body to offset that real people that are invested in our success. And I think we were talking about it earlier, but retail shareholders obviously becoming bigger as a group, bolder and much noisier, all enabled by digital platforms, which is fantastic. Nearly half of millennials were saying they were going to vote. and they're using social media to research companies and getting content from their community. So more of a brand orientation rather than trawling through those hundreds of pages of the ARA. But it can be really hard, as we know, to engage proactively. But I think if we can find ways to tap into the wisdom of small owners as stakeholders, that's a massive opportunity, and particularly when looked through the lens of purpose and sustainability and what you're trying to do to keep your eye on the ball of what's happening and what's changing. So treating small shareholders properly as stakeholders of the business, moving beyond ESG compliance to be led by actually listening, deep listening and learning and reacting, finding ways to converse that are accessible and engaging, and letting them make a contribution to strategy by listening. So it's the early warning system, but also that positive contribution where the opportunity lies. And in doing so, I think living up to this idea that we talk about a lot of being a purpose-led business, I think there's a real opportunity there. So that was probably more than 5 minutes.
No, that was brilliant. There's a lot there. Kirsty, there are 3 things that I'd love to come back on to with you, and also to ask Emma about. So number 1, fitness. So fitness of annual reports, and fitness of existing processes around engagement. And we talked about this earlier in the earlier sessions. And also there's a great TED Talk recently about chairs and tables, how companies, sometimes companies open up a chair or 2 for, say, for females, but then they don't fit in the chair. And the reason they don't fit in the chair is because the table is broken and needs to be rebuilt. So there's something in there. The second is, you know, when we spoke, you mentioned to me that you used to do at NatWest retail shareholder roadshows, and I hadn't even mentioned shareholder engagement, and I actually laughed in my head, and I thought that's actually so amazing. But those are costly and timely. Mm-hmm. So return on investment, you're both from PLCs, you have a lot of responsibility as co-sec in terms of all of that work around engagement and analyses, etc. So I'd love to explore return on investment and versus cost. And then ESG, oh my goodness, and maybe Georgia, you can come on this, and also Priscilla. I guess there's this disenchantment with ESG, and it's so big, ESG. So it would be good to touch on those things. So Emma, why don't we go to you with your thoughts?
Yep. So I suppose if I start really on the fitness, do you want me to start on the fitness of the annual report in particular? So every year, you know, it comes around, it's the annual report time. We start in around September, we finish around March in terms of the actual production of that. So it's a 6-month, very time-consuming exercise. It's very notable, actually, the process we go through. It gives us some great content, some great material that we can use throughout the rest of the year. So it's without doubt, it's a very valuable exercise to go through, especially for a smaller PLC to have that, because we don't really have the opportunity again throughout the year to do that exercise. However, the value of it in terms of small shareholders, I would question that, I'm afraid, because I think we spend a lot of time checking off, making sure that we've disclosed certain, you know, things that the people are looking for us to disclose, and I'm not entirely sure that that always brings the value that we think that our organisation is worth when we really look at the amount of time and effort that we put into that. I think you counter that with what retail investors are looking for, and again in the white paper actually that does sum it up nicely around knowing who your investors are, and the struggle that we have to actually find out who some of our investors are when their shares are held from nominee accounts. That we know that we will have some shareholders who would very much actually like to have the old-fashioned, although not sustainable, paper copy, and therefore they aren't even accessing the content that we are writing about. So, I think the financial statement serves one purpose, and then the content of the annual report, in terms of the narrative that we put against what the organisation has been doing and what it is going to be doing, could probably find a better medium to be expressed to shareholders. I love the idea of a retail shareholder roadshow, but finding a way to do that when you're a smaller PLC is the whole challenge that we have ahead of us.
And what do you think about the language used in a financial statement? Do you think that it could be more inclusive for novice or younger investors?
Without a doubt. I mean, I think any PLC audit committee and risk committee will have, a whole group of people around that table who are very skilled and knowledgeable and know what they're talking about.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. This is really ridiculous.
I would just question whether or not, when you're aiming that at a younger retail investor, whether or not they would have yet had the opportunity to grasp the full meaning of what that means.
Exactly.
So I think that it does need to be more inclusive in terms of the language that we're using to.
Or have different versions or variants,
different versions and better explanations.
So there's a lot in what you've said, and I want to pick on value of retail first. And it would be great, actually. It would have been great to have you at the last session. So PLCs with 25 retail shareholders. And I think frankness is really great. So I advise companies for many years, right? So I've heard everything. So I think just be as honest as possible. My experience is retail shareholder engagements is not popular with companies, hence us actually proceeding with the engagement appeal. So the value of retail, and then also these annual reports. So I'm ADHD. I always say I have the attention span of a fungus gnat. And then also the ecological footprint of a 250-page annual report is crazy. And then you have the proxy advisors who just completely missed the point of the annual report anyway. So what about AI? Can we use AI to basically standardize these annual reports? So I guess that's for both of you. But the value of retail.
We're hugely supportive of having retail investors. We'd like more. We think it plays well to what we do as an organisation. So that's one reason why we wanted to be involved as well, is that we think that it really, really helps us. I think sort of our view is, if we knew that we would have the engagement that justifies doing more with retail investors, then we absolutely would do that. But I think that's wherein the challenge lies, is getting retail investors interested and giving them a meaningful way to engage with us. We'll always happily speak to people on a one-to-one basis, but I think the traditional AGM model isn't really what a retail investor is necessarily looking for. I think it's a little bit too formal. It can be a little bit too staid, and I think they want to have the opportunity to talk informally, find out more about the organisation, and actually see and touch and feel.
Can you follow how many people watch, say, a strategy day or something that? Have you ever put them on?
We haven't.
Because a lot of companies now will put their strategy days, they'll put sector presentations and so on that have been done to analysts on the websites, and that is something that makes it quite easy for people, because you see people present, and it's a very strong message, even for the people that are not really involved or have a financial background, to see the excitement of people, and it just changes the whole relationship.
That's a really good point. And not to add, this is not an advert, but Investor Meet Company actually provides that kind of platform where you're able to be more inclusive by allowing participation through their platform. But I think what I'm getting to, ladies, is return on investment versus the cost. So doing a retail shareholder roadshow. So actually, you were mentioning identification. Yeah, it's actually not that expensive. It's not expensive anymore to analyze the register, but very few companies, it's heartbreaking.
Well, the experience we've had is actually they are doing it more than they used to.
Oh, really?
And
so drilling down to...
Yeah, well, it's some of the reasoning is you're now seeing traditional, long-only institutional investors actually putting up their hands when there's an issue now and actually being activist in the kind of less traditional sense. So some of the AGMs we've had where we've had investors putting up new nominees, not necessarily to replace the existing board, but to have some of representation on that board. And we know that we've got Catherine at Share Action, they come on regularly and then start trying to push for change. So we're getting more of that. So what we've seen is actually companies now including retail, because they realize that they can't just rely on necessarily traditional long only investors to carry the day, and they all want to beat 80%. So they want to mobilize as many investors as possible. And as Cheryl says, it's not actually that expensive an exercise because it's basically extracting the information from the nominees. So the kind of private client platforms like Hargreaves Lansdown, etc. That's a fairly it's an existing process which is well understood. Extracting that information and then putting telephone numbers against the individuals, and then using a call center or whatever it is to contact them, and then you can start engaging with those investors, getting feedback, and in fact you see them mobilizing quite well into voting situations. Still have to say, the caveat around it is that you're not getting a high percentage still, even even doing all of that, but it does improve it.
Yeah. So mindset shift and basically having repeatable behaviors. And I think the starting point is, what are your processes for identification? So maybe Kirsty, what do you guys do? Are you drilling down?
So I don't sit on the governance side of things, so it's not my field specifically in terms of how that gets managed. How we try and engage with retail shareholders is by offering, as you've said already, we a few years ago we did a series of retail shareholder events where we went around to different regions in the UK and did it as kind of like a mini AGM, but without a full board, and a panel of the executive committee, perhaps 3 or 4 people, and it was just a way of having that direct engagement and taking the AGM out of Edinburgh in our case. And it was fantastic in many ways because it enabled us to have really good conversations with the retail shareholder base, but it was still quite hard to do because you have to ship a roadshow around the country, which takes time and money, and still you're setting up a scenario that may not be, however accessible you try and make it, it's still inaccessible for people, and it may not be conducive to people wanting to stick up their hand in a room full of people.
Just with regard to process, you talked about the 6-month annual report post. Oh my goodness. And then the consultations running up to the AGM, and then if you have a remuneration related matters, then the actual register analysis. So could you give us your thoughts on how you are handling register analysis, and then also if 5% of your if only 5% of your register is retail, is it worth for companies to actually take the time to analyze that component and engage that component?
So I suppose dealing with the first part, we have to date focused on our larger investors, but that is something that we are looking to try and deliberately change tack on. So if you've only got 5% or smaller as retail investors, yes, it is worth it. And I think it's really the experience of knowing that you have to keep plugging away and you have to keep working on it year on year if you want to see it change. And we sit around here now. Sustainability wasn't something that was the focus of our lives, but now it has become. So everything we're trying to do is in the veil of, is it sustainable? Whatever that may mean to you in terms of creating long-term sustainable success and an ongoing business, I suppose. So if you apply that in the same method to retail shareholders, then you probably need to set your goals quite low for year one, but know and think about what can you do to change that and how you can go out to engage people differently to increase that. So I do think it is worth it, because otherwise you won't see a change. We'll be in the same place next year.
You can also engage retail investors out on the various share platforms, the chat platforms related to whatever company.
But Adam, in working with companies, what they always wanted from us is proof that those in the chat are actual shareholders. So most of the time, they're opining, but where are they actually sitting on the register? So I think there's some really great points, made by Mark, Kirsty, yourself. Literally, the engagement appeal has a duty to help make this process easier, and basically, I think, demystify it. So it is not expensive anymore. Register analysis. There's so much tech available in terms of including investors in things like roadshows, like Investor Meet Company, and then the drilling down, as you said, it's about managing expectations. And EasyJet said this as well, and it was really great to hear that from them. They're saying, you know what, this is doable. It literally is just about managing expectations and saying that in year one we can do this, in year two, and then it's repeatable behaviors. So registered shareholders, we get it. Those behind nominees, Section 793 of the Companies Act, we get it. It becomes more complicated when we're dealing with the retail behind the funds, right? So then you have the whole pass-through voting situation. What are people's views on that? And we do have a pass-through voting expert here. But Kirsty, should we start with you on that? So
I think we should start with the expert. Big question. And very yours.
Yeah. So I think the what we were discussing earlier is you've got fund managers who are managing the funds, right? So they're meant to be the experts. And you've got the corporate governance team who advise on proxy voting. And then I personally have friends who I've been surprised by, who are fund managers and corporate governance managers, who I would have expected to be fully supportive of pass-through voting, but they're not. And I asked why, and their response is, well, I'm being paid to be the expert, to make decisions on behalf of clients who don't have the same expertise as me. And so then my power is being taken away to give to the retail. So then that put me in a position where I'm not sure what my answer is. What would be your answer to that?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated topic, but I think that pass-through voting, so the idea that a fund manager would delegate some or all of their voting power to their underlying clients, both institutional and retail, is really just part of a broader trend of democratization of wealth and giving people much more flexibility and much more choice about how their money speaks for them or how they invest into the market. And it is a choice. Fund managers are not forcing the vote on the underlying retail or institutional investor. It has to be something that they want. And if they don't want it, then the fund manager will continue to vote on their behalf. So you could think of it as a product feature in the same way that BlackRock has hundreds of funds on offer. Today they have one vote policy, or let's say a year ago they had one vote policy, and now they have 14. And so in the same way you can choose a fund, you can choose a voting strategy that aligns with your investment outlook, or what you're trying to achieve. And I think the starkest example where you see the reason for that might be, for example, Camden as a local government pension scheme have some segregated mandate where they, as experts, already vote on behalf of a portion of their assets, but they also have some assets invested in a pooled fund, and they're interested in being able to overlay the same vote policy they have over here, over there. And so I guess they've already put in the work to think about what is their worldview, what time horizon are they thinking about, what issues, social, environmental, obviously governance, and how financially material each of those issues are, they believe. They put in that work to create a vote policy that they believe represents them and what their underlying pension members would want and need, I guess, from their pension fund outcomes. And they want to overlay that in a pooled fund, and they expect their fund manager to be able to do that for them. And I think that's a relatively new expectation, and it's only been a thing for the last 18 months. But there is pressure, I guess, if you look at European or British pension funds who are investing with US-based fund managers, there is significant political pressure on both sides of the Atlantic in, you could argue, diverging directions. And so it's becoming more important for the ability, like a UK-based pension fund, to be able to control voting outcomes. If you think voting and engagement is important, if you think stewardship matters, then it is imperative to Scottish Widows that they are able to follow through on their net zero commitments through their stewardship, and therefore they have taken back voting control from BlackRock. And while BlackRock manage their assets and I effectively choose where to invest, albeit they're a passive manager, it is actually Scottish Widows who decide how they will vote on the climate vote at Exxon or Chevron or BP or Shell, and every other vote for that matter, director elections, pay votes. And I think the extension of that to the retail investor is totally possible and totally valid if it's executed well.
Yeah.
My point this morning, you were talking about the ESG, the Charles Schwab thing, is that I think platforms need to take a lot of responsibility for how the investor experience is. Like, I don't think it's just PLCs. I think that investment platforms are their onboarding flows are pretty slick, right? Because that's how people get their AUM into the platform, and that's what their return is based on. And then everything after that, like how the investor engages with the companies they own directly, or how they understand the importance of like fund management over their lifetime. There's underinvestment in that area because it's not regulated, and therefore they don't have to care about it. And because the investors already put their AUM in, so they're incentivized really for them just to keep it there and not worry too much. And I think platforms have to work harder at getting that right, because you can do all the work in the world as a PLC, and you talk about your channels, but your main channel to reach your investors on the retail side has to be through the investment platforms. And then I guess big question mark for me about how well that's facilitated at the moment, whether you're talking about ESG or whatever. Yeah.
So intermediation is a barrier?
Yeah, I think to good engagement, definitely, and to shareholder democracy also.
There you go. So basically, intermediation has been helpful in the democratization of buying and selling of shares, but has not been helpful on the engagement side.
I think it can be, though. I mean, I think it's useful for, I don't know, I assume it'd be useful for you to know, well, my retail investors sit across Interactive Investor, Hargreaves, and AJ Bell, and I can reach them through these channels because they're pulled together through an intermediated platform. I guess it's about being able to work with those platforms to facilitate that experience. And from the shareholder democracy perspective, we have the same problem. If you take, I'm just use Nutmeg as an example, they create model portfolios for retail investors, invest them in groups of funds, but while Nutmeg may decide tomorrow that they would like to allow those retail investors to be able to vote on the underlying holdings, it would take JP Morgan, their core asset manager, to be able to also move in unison with them to want to accept those votes from the retail investor. And I guess when you have two different companies regulated slightly differently, sometimes listing in different parts of the world, it's hard to create that alignment so that the intermediation can work in our favour.
I'm going to go back to the two ladies, but just before doing that, I think one of the things you, Chimelo and Make My Money Matter, did so well was to educate the public, especially Gen Z millennials, that they are shareholders, and that they have funds, and that because they have funds, they have shares, and to actually ask questions about their shareholdings. And I really love that personally when I first discovered Chimelo, that you were empowering human beings about their investment. And what do you think?
Can I put this whole way of putting it is, I don't want to say hypocritical, but it is in a way, because there is no way that when you see the advance of the passive investments, passive funds that are out there, we couldn't really expect the retail shareholders to respond to hundreds of requests or votes on those companies, of which that get moved around at the speed at which they get moved around in the passive fund. So somewhere along the way, that bit, we should probably not think about it. We should be looking at the people that really are actively involved, being exposed to companies. Sorry, I'm an active fund manager.
Yes.
And they're investing in companies, and I just find it very difficult. If you do not like what this company is doing, you should not be invested in it. If you like the purpose of it, it's just not going in the right direction, but this company has a fantastic opportunity and change and evolve over the time and actually be a purpose-led business. And then you want to be part of it and you want to vote in it. But if you're invested in a passive fund, you do not care. And I'm afraid for me, that's something that concerns me and worries me personally, and the attitude towards companies, which basically are people. So I wouldn't worry too much about how you actually access these people to get their votes, because somewhere along the way, you won't get the response, and it's not worth it. And I would think that the return on investment
It's a valid point you
very
make.
low.
Very valid point, actually, because by the passive fund, by its very nature, the investors leaving it to others, and they're not looking to be as engaged as a direct purchase of shares.
I actually
or you
don't agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Because you invest in an ETF because you are engaged. Because the ETF invests in a specific product, or like a commodity or something like that. Whereas if you put your money with an active fund manager, you're leaving it to the fund manager to make the decisions on your behalf. So in some ways, it's exactly the reverse.
Yeah, but if you buy a fund, if you go to a fund manager, Fundsmith, for example, you don't say, I'm going to invest in Fundsmith. You always have a run through the holdings. You always see where that fund manager is thinking. So you always have to look at what that fund consists
Or you just look at the weightings, because those funds, the companies will change. So you look at the weightings in which jurisdictions, what sectors, etc. Okay, that makes sense. I'm going to back that.
Look, if we look at passive investing, that to me is a glorified saving account. That's not really investing.
Okay, so I've opened the can.
You could go on for hours.
Yes. So I want to hear from. Okay, sorry, Chris.
Go.
I want to hear from the PLC. So, Emma, remind me. So, Essentra, investor relations. You've got an investor relations team.
Yes.
And how coordination are the two, the company secretary and the IR team?
We work very closely together. We are very small. We're very slim. Team would be overdoing it. It's a couple of people, but we work very closely together throughout the year to coordinate the work that we're doing, particularly around the annual report and results and interims and any trading updates.
And the monthly register analysis.
Yeah.
So you guys have that, and then checking that you're drilling down the PCBs. Any thoughts from you on what is being discussed here. So obviously when one is doing, let's say, a corporate governance roadshow, so when I've run this at the old firm, we would do the top 20 for standard business, and then for M&A we go down to the top 100, and then the client would say, "Whoops, that's a lot." So what are people's thoughts on the time spent on engaging versus, again, what the return that you get?
I mean, I could answer that with the hat of sustainability on. So not being in governance or in IR, but working really closely with those teams. I would say two things. One is increasingly over the past, let's say, 4 years, maybe, the amount of time and interest in direct conversations with the people at the coalface of sustainability in the business has just gone like that, which is a really positive thing. I would also say that the kind of, what's the best way, the sort of maturity, I suppose, the sort of sophistication of the questions that we are asked and the conversations that we're having is equally kind of increased like that at the same time as well. So much more deeper level of sensitivity to what we're doing, building on the conversation we had last time rather than kind of going through a checklist. So that feels like a very positive thing. I still think there is a gap, however, between the notion of, am I talking to a business, if this is what you're looking for, am I talking to a business that is truly driven by its purpose and is being led by that and is operationalizing that and is forming strategy based on that and its culture is centered on that, to understanding where the ESG risks lie and how well they're being managed in an organization. And those are two different things. And they're both really important, but they can be quite different. So, I think that's where sometimes there can be a bit of a disconnect, because the former can be quite hard to actually, understand, and everyone's doing it in a different way. So how do you kind of approach that, and how do you really get to the heart of understanding that?
Sounds like that there's a need for investor relations reform.
I think there's the need for some uniformity, so that we all know, and I think, Kirsty, you said at the start, around too many different standards, and which indices are you going to report against, who are you going to send your information to, and get gold, bronze, or silver, or no reward back. And I think some uniformity would hugely help all investors, because we'd be looking at a level playing field.
Yeah, that was actually a point made by your fellow nominee, Srini Vasandan Katakrishnan, so Venkat. So he's the chair of a mining company, FTSE 100 Endeavour, and also the chair, also a NED of BlackRock World Mining, which has been picked up by the Daily Mail as being exemplary in that they voluntarily Section 793 their private client brokers, so they identified their underlying holders and actually invited them to the AGM. So obviously there's time and cost associated to that, but they believe that it was worth it, worth the investment. And for the press they got, the positive feedback, clearly they felt that it was a good thing. So there's all of those things happening, and the UK is transparent enough. It's like, I guess it's just about the companies taking up these activities, right?
With the engagement appeal, we don't feel we're not putting all the weight on the companies. We also think we need to work on the retail investors and get them more engaged as well. We need a twin pronged attack to get them both engaged. The AGM was mentioned before, and I've been to AGMs where the person in front of us had a question to ask, and he was absolutely shaking like a leaf because the nature of it can be intimidating. But the engagement appeal should be able to help with that.
But the point that Venkat was actually making, so he mentioned what BlackRock World Mining was doing, and he thought that was great, and he was demonstrating that look how exemplary we are. But he also said in the UK there's a major problem of too many initiators, too many initiatives to sign up to, and to comply with, and he was saying that for the for company secretary, IR, for the board, it's mind-boggling. So is what he's saying in line with what you're saying?
Yes.
And so how do we clean that up? How do we make things more uniform? How many can you count, Emma and Kirsty? I don't know the number of initiatives that you have to comply with. Maybe we could
I don't have that to the top of my head.
No, I don't either, and that tells you how many there are in terms of reporting standards and who you align with. Yeah, I mean, there's just a multitude. Some older, some newer. It's changing all the time. It's a job in itself to keep abreast of what the dynamics are, who's changing, and what's changing year on year. So that's the standards, and then you've got the indices.
Lauren,
Two related
The
things.
regulation is just changing, but there's just so many different ones. But I suppose over time it will
Consolidate.
consolidate.
Yeah, it
But
is,
at the
and that
moment,
will
so
happen.
it's important for the companies to just be able to
Yeah.
concentrate on the material ones that need to respond to what people really care. That will really show the company why you should be invested in the company.
absolutely.
And it's all the reporting. I think it's nice to see how people are changing the way they always come back to the quality of the website, because that's what people then comes back to your numbers. Being able to navigate a website and the information like starting off, why should you be investing in the company? If the company cannot put that in how can it attract a retail investor that hasn't got time to do the research, but a professional investor would? There's it comes back, I think it does come back to doing the website right.
And there's more scope there as well
Yeah.
than you have within the annual report.
Yeah.
So
We need to make it so much more lively for people of all backgrounds and knowledge to
And also reach out to certain age groups via maybe YouTube or something like that. In addition, some live stream on YouTube. There's a whole many ways to deliver it.
So just being mindful of time. I think we've got about 5 minutes, 10 minutes left. Just a couple of questions more. It's AGM season. Proxy advisors. Where do they fit into this? What are your thoughts? And then AGMs. Are they a platform for engagement? And what is the best platform? What is the best format for an AGM? Is it in person only, digital only, or hybrid? So proxy advisor first.
I was going to go AGM first, actually. My personal view, I mean, I completely love the premise of an AGM still. And the original premise of an AGM and the principle of it, that you can open your doors and anyone that owns can have access, whoever they are, and stand up and ask any question, I think is absolutely brilliant. And we should not let go of that anytime soon. Not that anyone's suggesting that happens. But I think in the construct and the formatting of the events, it becomes exclusive. However hard however much effort you make to make it accessible, it becomes very quickly very exclusive, because it's not accessible, it's not friendly, and even if you can actually get there physically or virtually, it's still really, really hard to kind of put your hand up and ask the question that perhaps is important to you that you want to ask. So I think we've got a long way to go. I personally feel that they should be, the technology exists, we should be hybrid. There's no good reason that shouldn't be the case, and I think we should be accessible like that. That's a personal opinion of mine, but we haven't cracked the right way to physically or virtually, I think, give people the accessibility they need to interact, which is what that original premise of an AGM should stand up to.
So again, process and maybe guidance.
Yeah.
Emma.
I'd agree with Kirsty's view. I think hybrid is the way to go. We've tried it over the last couple of years. We haven't actually had much success in terms of team, unfortunately. But I've tried it in other organisations as well, and we haven't had no success. I agree with the formatting, the formalness of the AGM doesn't encourage and foster the ability to ask questions. But I do think the opportunity to have that more, to use it as an event effectively, and really stage it as the whole day. It's an opportunity to get to know people running the company, whether that's the board or senior management. Depending on what the company does, it's an opportunity to actually explore what your purpose is, what you make, or what you do, services. But therein lies the problem, I think, of doing the hybrid, is how you make one event work for both people, without having a team of people able to run that for you.
Yeah. We were at that dinner, right? The GC
Yes.
stat. We won't tell what the stat. We won't say what the stats were, but I was very surprised at the views on hybrid because of the reasons that you mentioned. So again, there's that. It's not that expensive to apply the technology, but it is an additional cost. And then again, for the company, it's determining, is that 6,000, 10,000, or 30,000 worth it for 2 people using it? But then maybe there's a point for the company around communications if only 2 people are using it or something.
Yeah.
It's
a trend though, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got to start
somewhere.
Once they find out that you can actually access, being able to watch the BP, the Shell, or the Total Energy AGM. I mean,
yeah.
As a retail shareholder, for me, having the physical AGM as an anchor is really important in respect of governance and shareholder democracy. I'm very concerned that there's a suggestion about going digital only. That will just be a massive deterioration in democratic rights and governance, because the AGM will get shorter and shorter, and it'll just end up being a series of emails and a newsletter, right? And going back to the formal aspect of an AGM, it's quite intimidating for some people. But what's beautiful about an AGM is that after the AGM, there is conversation, and the person that's maybe nervous to stand up and ask a question in the formal setting is quite happy in the informal. And the other point is, it should be a celebration of the company that day. It shouldn't be the board nervous of hearing from the retailers. It should be a celebration of the company. We are invested in the company. We want to see it do well. We want to celebrate the success.
That's a really good point.
I'd see the hybrid process being the right way to go as well. But I just wonder, because the ones I've experienced and sat in on, there's been somebody in between the board and the question determining what questions are asked, and that worries me, because presumably what could happen is that they just won't ask, they just won't put the kind of harder questions, the trickier questions to the board. It'll only be the kind of company-friendly ones that you'll get to hear. And I just wonder how you can get around that.
I've been in hybrid meetings, well-intentioned hybrid meetings, and the people on the floor, they stand up and they ask their incredibly long question, and they get freedom to do that. And the company I'm thinking of, it was very, very well-intentioned, and they're listening to everybody on the floor, taking the questions, and it's like, oh, we've got some questions online, and the guy means well, but he quickly runs through and then paraphrases a question, and it doesn't mean any harm, does not mean any harm, but it's kind of a human nature thing, which we have to learn how to do better. So we're not necessarily up to speed on doing hybrid yet. So there's an imbalance between the physical. It's not there yet.
So we're still learning, and I think there's guidance that needs to be put in place. So for me, it's my intention to own shares in every single listed company and to attend the AGMs, either in person or virtually. But I don't need massive catering, and it pains me when I go to an event like an AGM and there's like all these sandwiches and so it's abundance of like food that is just for me not necessary. But then maybe so that's for
they're
companies
not all
too.
that. They're not a buffet fest. I've been to plenty of AGMs where there's a couple of digestives and that's about as much as you get.
Then I think
which is fine.
that's what it should be.
Despite popular belief, it's not this buffet obsession that shareholders go for. If you want a cup of coffee, sure. But
that's okay. I our guys at the end here. Hey Gabriel, you're creating a platform. So please, like in briefly, what you guys are doing, and then your thoughts on physical participation and what Georgia has mentioned.
I run a startup based in Cambridge. I'm a student with cause, and we're developing a social network of activists. So the current Extinction Rebellion are just all kind of activists. And I really agree with the whole anchor point idea. I think that a lot of the problems with social media at the moment, but I think that the sort of the chief problem is that too often it kind of gives us the illusion of affecting change. Because quite often you go on social media, you share something, you post, and you feel like you've done something. And actually all you're doing is contributing to an echo chamber. An echo chamber where just other people like you are going to receive that like, see your post. And I think AGM, it's really important to talk to people of my generation, let them know that there isn't this big scary world of capitalism, which kind of, I think, incorrectly, based on what I've learned today, has this connotation of anti-democracy. And let people know that democracy is at the heart of reform right here. It's all about giving people a voice and making sure that AGMs are rooted in physical change, right? Physical applying pressure, seeing people on board is a really good step towards that.
Anything to add?
Just agreeing. I think that the physical is really important. I work on a dad at his own company, and when I started, I said, "Oh, we could just Zooms and stuff, right? Like team schools. We don't need to go away to London. We don't have to have this meeting. Like, it's fine." And after about 6 months, I thought actually it's really important to have that face to face and build a relationship with people that you want to work with for a really long time. So if you have retail shareholders and you want them to be shareholders for a really long time, you need to build that relationship. And obviously there's limitations with distance and costs and things like that, but being able to cater to everyone as well as possible is really important, I think, in having an investor base that wants to be an investor rather than a trader and help the company grow over a long period.
Thank you.
But also, if a company is concerned that they've got activists showing up, the problem isn't the AGM. The problem is, why are they getting activists? That in itself is a statement that there's something that needs to be addressed. Activists aren't the enemy. They've got an issue to raise, so they should be listened to.
Okay. Well, any closing remarks, Kirsty, Emma?
I found it really interesting. I think it's very interesting hearing the views down this end of the room, which slightly contrasts with what we were thinking up this end of the room actually about the AGM. But I think really it's around making sure that we've got a platform to hear what our retail investors are saying to us. We have the methods of finding out who investors are. We just need to be actually a little bit more active and proactive about doing it. So I take away for myself actually a couple of things that I'm going to go off and think about what I can do for Essentra and move that forward, having heard some really good range of views.
Great. Thank you so much. Kirsty?
Yeah, I've found it, I've learned a lot just sitting in the room listening to everyone. And I think this idea of sharing better between us as we're testing things, we're finding out what's working, what doesn't work, the different segments of the retail shareholder base, because they are very different, but sharing that learning and really having access to it across sectors, across corporations, I think, across different types of organisations as well is really, really important. But it does feel like the will and the momentum is there, the technology is there, and yet we're kind of led behind barriers getting us in the way of us being able to kind of make progress. So I think the engagement appeal could be a really good key to perhaps unlock, share, and help unlock some of those hurdles. The more I listen to everyone, it's quite striking, isn't it?
Thank you for that, Kirsty, and thank you, Emma, and everyone. Talking is good, isn't it? Engagement. Maybe it's not for me, it's certainly not a very Asian thing, and maybe it's not a very British thing, but maybe it's a thing that is just really, it's just important to just talk and develop mutual understanding. Thank you, Mark.
Lovely. Cheryl, and to the team from the Engagement Appeal, thank you very much for your time on behalf of Investor Meet Company. Good afternoon to you all, and that ends today's session. Thank you.
I like Mark.
It sounds like a pilot.
It does.